Okay, welcome to Chapter 4, everybody. We're going to be going over the skin and body membranes. This is Chapter 4 in your lecture book. Remember that when we're referring here to membranes, we're talking about a tissue that has a common function, and the tissue is made up of both epithelial and connective tissue in most cases. This is different from the cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins that's responsible for maintaining the integrity of the cell and also allowing protection and identification, so that the immune system knows that that cell belongs in the human body, as well as serving as a semi-permeable membrane that would be a barrier through which certain things can enter and leave the cell and other things can't. So the function of these body membranes is to cover body surfaces, line body cavities, and form protective sheets around organs, and they're classified according to their tissue types. Among the epithelial membranes include cutaneous, mucous, and serous membranes, and among connective tissue membranes include the synovial membranes. Now, with the exception of the cutaneous membranes, all of these membranes are classified according to their secretions. Mucous membranes secrete mucus, which has a protective and a lubricating effect. Serous membranes secrete serous fluid, which has a lubricating effect. And synovial membranes, which are found primarily in diarthrotic, that would be freely movable joints, produce synovial fluid, which allows ease of movement. So here we're looking at an example of the cutaneous membrane. This would be your skin. It is a dry membrane. It forms our outermost protective boundary. It is made up of superficial epidermis composed of keratinized squamous epithelial cells and an underlying dermis that is mostly dense connective tissue. So what we're seeing here are two different types of tissues acting as an organ. Okay, in this case epithelial and connective tissue, as well as nerve tissue and adipose tissue, um, all acting together to provide the body an organ that's important in regulating body temperature, in maintaining the body's fluid balance, and protecting the body from invasion, and in synthesizing vitamin D, and also uh, as a um, major sensory organ. Okay, that would be the nervous function of the skin. And you can see here the location of the skin. This is your outer body's covering. The skin is constantly shed and regenerated on a daily basis. This is a protective function of the skin. It keeps bacterial, viral, and fungal infections from setting up to the point where they can actually penetrate this outer layer and get into the inner tissues of the body and cause profound disease states. In addition to that, the secretions of the skin have an antibacterial function in the sweat and in the oils that are produced by the sudiferous and sebaceous glands. This retards bacterial growth, it keeps the skin supple, maintains our fluid balance, and so it has this protective and homeostatic role for the entire body. In individuals who have been injured to the point where the regenerative layer of the skin has been compromised, the skin will heal back, forming a scar, and this is primarily connective tissue made up of an extracellular matrix protein called collagen, which is very good at sealing the wound, but it doesn't have all the same homeostatic functions of skin because it lacks a lot of the accessory structures. It doesn't have sweat or oil glands. It doesn't have hair. It lacks a lot of vascularization, not a lot of blood vessels in there. And it also is somewhat devoid of nerve endings. So this is simply a fail-safe for the body to try and seal the inside of the body from the outside. If the skin is injured to the point where we don't break through what we call the germinative layer of the epithelium, and this would be the stratum basale, and we'll learn more about that in a little bit, the skin will regenerate and have full function. So it's important that these adult stem cells, which are in the deeper layers of the epidermis, the layer of the skin that lies above the dermis, which is mostly connective tissue, remain intact so that the skin can regenerate and retain its homeostatic function. Mucous membranes are a bit different. These are surface epithelia, and the type of mucous membrane depends on the site. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue is found in the mouth and the esophagus, and of course the secretion is mucus. Mucus has a lubricating but it also a protective effect. In the respiratory system, it's good at trapping particulates in the air that we breathe so that we don't get them into the lungs, where it can cause the lungs to scar. And in the digestive system, here indicated by the esophagus, it's a lubricant, so it helps the food slide down the tract a lot easier. Simple columnar epithelia is found in the rest of the digestive tract, and there is underlying loose connective tissue beneath all of these mucous membranes. It's deemed the lamina propria. This type of membrane lines all body cavities that are open to an exterior body surface, and it's adapted for absorption and secretion. And I know it's kind of odd to think, well, wait a minute, body cavity open to the exterior. How so? And what we have to remember is that in the digestive system, the entire digestive system is open to two ends, right? The oral cavity and the anus. And in the respiratory system, it's open via the oral cavity and the nasal cavity to the outside. So um, you have to think in terms of these membranes really covering an exterior surface, even though this exterior surface goes deep down inside the body. It's never really within the body's tissues until it's absorbed across the linings of these systems. In the respiratory system, that doesn't happen until we get to the squamous epithelia that line the alveoli of the lungs. And in the digestive system, we really don't start absorbing products into the bloodstream until we get into the small intestine. And at that point, we will see columnar epithelia with villi on their surface that are designed perfectly for that particular task. Serous membranes are a little bit different. They produce serous fluid, which is a lubricating fluid. The surface is a layer of simple squamous epithelium. The underlying layer is a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. It lines open body cavities that are closed to the exterior of the body. Serous membranes occur in pairs, usually separated by serous fluid, that lubricating fluid we spoke of earlier. The visceral layer covers the outside of the organ, and the parietal layer defines the portion of the wall of the ventral body cavity. Now, the way to think about it is sort of like this model represents, right, where we've got this fist plunged inside a partially deflated balloon. The visceral serous membrane would represent that part that's closest to the fist, and the parietal serous membrane would represent that part that lines the cavity inside which the fist is thrust. And then the air in a serous membrane would be actually serous fluid and also a little bit of air. And this is the lubricating function of the serous membrane. So you've got two thin layers of membrane and a slippery fluid between them. And the primary reason for this is to allow the organ the ability to move internally with, again, not producing an undue amount of irritation, inflammation, and scarring. So that's its overall purpose. And here you can see an example of some serous membranes. What we're looking at here are the serous membranes of the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the peritoneal membrane, which lines the container inside which the small and large intestine, liver, the stomach all sit. Okay, so I would be tracing here the peritoneal membrane. Okay, going around like so. Okay, that's the peritoneum. You maybe have heard the term peritoneum if you've ever heard of the term peritonitis, which is an infection of the peritoneum that can sometimes happen in the event of a ruptured appendix, where the bacteria can flood the abdominal pelvic cavity from the large intestine and then by infecting the peritoneum, cause it to inflame, and this produces irritation and pain. And the next possible step in this process is the entry of bacteria into the blood, which is called septicemia, this very dangerous condition. The pleura are the double-layered membranes that surround the lungs, and again, the serous fluid allows the lungs to expand and contract without producing an undue amount of friction, so this eases the work of breathing. Again, remember that all of the organs that we're looking at in the body to some degree move, okay? They pulsate or they wiggle or they squeeze in order to carry out their functions. You know that the lungs expand and contract, the heart is constantly beating. The gastrointestinal system is always constantly moving as it pushes contents through the tube that runs from the oral cavity all the way to the rectum and the anus. Even the liver and the spleen and the stomach have some degree of movement, and so they need this lubricating layer around them so that they don't scar and inflame. Around the heart is the pericardial cavity, a double-walled sac again which contains pericardial fluid, a type of serous fluid that lubricates the heart as it beats. Okay, so again, keep in mind that these organs are constantly moving. Without this lubricating effect, they would scar, they would inflame, they would inflict severe damage on themselves. This is why if you've ever looked at a dissected, non-preserved specimen, either an animal specimen or a human specimen, you'll find that the visceral contents, the internal organs, are very slippery to the touch, very difficult to hold on to. It's because of this serous fluid. Now, another type of membrane is the synovial membrane. It's made up primarily of connective tissue, and it lines fibrous capsules that surround the joints, and it secretes a lubricating fluid known as synovial fluid. The cells that secrete this are called synoviocytes, and the joints where you find this type of membrane are your freely movable joints, things like your fingers, your knees, your hips, your elbow, your shoulder, just to name a few. And the purpose of this fluid is to cushion and protect the joint, but also to provide for ease of movement. It is a lubricating fluid, and as a result, when the joint cavity is perfused with this synovial fluid, it makes it very easy for the joint to execute its range of motion when the muscles that cross the joint pull on the joint and either cause it to flex or extend or perform any of a number of different joint movements that are possible depending on the joint that we're considering. And you can see here a cross section through a joint cavity. You can see the extracapsular ligaments here. Okay, most joints have extracapsular ligaments. Most freely movable joints do, and some joints have what are called intracapsular ligaments, which are bands of connective tissue that stabilize the joint from within the synovial cavity. The articular cartilage is a layer of connective tissue at the ends of the bones which pads and protects the joints. If they were to bounce off of each other, to pound on each other, the cartilage would protect the ends of the bones. Remember that cartilage is one of those unusual connective tissues that doesn't grow back. And so as we damage cartilage, we start to lose the protective covering at the ends of bones. And if we abuse a joint or badly injure a joint and compromise the cartilage, it won't grow back. It often has to be surgically removed in order to repair the joint. The problem, of course, with this is that as the cartilage is removed from the ends of the bones, which are called the epiphyses, this is an epiphysis and this is an epiphysis, what can frequently happen is that the bone will hit the bone on the other side of the joint, and that'll knock chips of bone away called bone spurs, and those bone spurs will irritate and inflame the joint, and that's a condition known as osteoarthritis. Is the joint inflammation that results from a lifetime of use of a particular joint or abuse of a particular joint, and it's something that we'll all suffer from in time. You can also see the fibrous capsule which is the connective tissue that surrounds the outside of the joint, and of course the synovial membrane with the synoviocytes that secrete the fluid that fills the joint. The integumentary system is the largest organ in the body. Remember that an organ is a collection of tissues that perform a particular task for the organism. Your skin, which is a cutaneous membrane, uh, is the most significant part of this system. Its derivatives include sweat and oil glands, as well as hair and nails. The sweat and oil glands are exocrine glands, meaning that their secretions are sent through a duct which empties onto a surface, in this case the outer surface of the skin, as opposed to an endocrine gland, which has no duct and which secretes its components directly into the bloodstream through some form of membrane transport. Other structures include, of course, the hair and the nails, which are primarily protective. However, the hair also has a thermal regulatory function in that it tends to regulate body temperature, particularly when we're cold and the hair stands up. It produces a layer of dead air between the skin and the outside environment. The hair also provides a sensory function. It allows us to tell whether or not something is crawling on our skin as the hair shafts move, the hair root and bulb move, and the nerve endings that are wrapped around those hairs can pick up that light sensitive touch, and we can respond to it appropriately. Other functions of the skin include protection from mechanical damage and chemical damage, as well as bacterial damage, protection from ultraviolet radiation, thermal damage, and desiccation, which is drying out. We'll go through each of these in detail. Let's look first at one of its more interesting functions, uh, its ability to regulate our body temperature. And it does this by increasing or decreasing the amount of vasodilation in the dermal layer of the skin, bringing blood closer to the surface of the body, which gets cooled by the drying of the sweat that's produced by the sudiferous glands. As the sweat goes from a liquid to a vapor, it takes heat energy with it that cools the blood at the surface, and as a result cools the body. Its heat retaining function is primarily described by the hair, right, which becomes erect when we're cold, but it also has an assist in that when it's cold outside, the dermal capillaries will vasoconstrict and redirect blood to the core in an effort to try and keep your vital organs functioning while sacrificing perhaps the temperature of the skin. Again, prioritizing what's most important for your survival. It aids in the excretion of urea and uric acid. These are nitrogen-containing wastes, and the reason that we have to get rid of these is that if they were to build up inside the blood and the interstitial fluid, they would affect the pH of those fluids drastically, and that would cause electrical activity in the body to eventually shut down, and it would cause enzymatic reactions in many cases to stop. And at that point, cells would die, tissues would die, organs would die, and then eventually the organism could die. The other major organ system that gets rid of these nitrogenous wastes is the urinary system, which consists of the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. The skin also synthesizes vitamin D, which is critically important for the mineralization of bone. The skeletal system is important in maintaining the structure of the human body, providing a framework around which to hang the soft tissues, allowing us to move, and also providing us the ability to have posture. Okay, so protective function, movement function. It's also a mineral storehouse. Lots of calcium and phosphate, along with other minerals, are found in bone, and so it's a reservoir for those components when they're needed in the bloodstream. And this is just a cross section through a little cube of human skin. Okay, you're getting a sort of a three-dimensional look at what the skin looks like. The epidermis is the outermost layer, and it's primarily stratified squamous epithelial cells, which are cornified at their most superficial surface, um, and as they're produced by the stratum basale, which is the germ layer of the epidermis. Um, and the purpose for this is to provide mechanical support and also provide a waterproofing function for the skin so that we don't simply soak up water when we get wet. The only way water should enter the body is if we drink it. As the squamous epithelial cells move away from the stratum basale, they become more and more distant from the blood supply and they begin to die. And so there are layers within the epidermis of cells that are in the process of dying or are in fact dead once we get to the stratum corneum. And again, this is by design. The skin is designed to be shed and reproduced constantly as a guard against processes such as infection. Um, it's also an avascular tissue. Most of the cells are keratinocytes. Most of the blood vessels lie in the hypodermal layer and to some extent in the dermal layer, but the epidermal layer is avascular for the most part. The stem cells get their oxygen and nutrients via diffusion, and that's what keeps this stem cell population alive. The dermis is made up of dense connective tissue, uh, and it contains a lot of different organs. You can see here sudiferous glands and sebaceous glands and hair follicles, which contain a hair root and a bulb and a hair shaft that protrudes from the skin, all of which are produced by the follicle itself. There's also nerve endings in here that respond to things like pain and pressure and hot and cold. In addition to that, you'll find muscles attached to every hair follicle in the body. This is smooth muscle tissue. It's known as the erector pili muscle, and when we become cold or frightened, the muscle will pull on the hair follicle and the hairs will stand straight up. And this provides the effect in cold temperatures of retaining heat, and it has its protective function when we're frightened, um, to make us look larger than we are by causing our hair to stand on end. This isn't a major component now that we have relatively little body hair, but back when we were running around on all fours and had a thick coat of hair from head to foot, this response, the ability of the hair to stand up on end and make us look larger, kept us from being eaten by predators that would otherwise try to consume us. And then below the dermis is the hypodermis. Hypo meaning below, dermis meaning dermis. And it's comprised mostly of adipose tissue that has a lot of blood vessels in it. Again, if you've ever gotten a shot at the doctor's office, he will take out a hypodermic needle in order to administer the drug. And the reason for this is to get the drug as close to the blood supply as we possibly can. Okay, if we look at the different layers of the epidermis, we could start with the deepest layer. This is the stratum germinativum, also sometimes called the stratum basale. It's the deepest layer. It lies next to the dermis and below all the other epidermal layers. And on a thin slide, it has a wavy borderline with the dermis that anchors the two together. And this wavy borderline is produced by the papillary layer of the dermis that sort of protrudes into the stratum basale. And in the fingertips and in the toes and in the soles of the hands and the palms of the feet, this is what produces our prints. Okay, in other layers of the skin, other areas of the skin, we don't see this as much because the skin is a bit thicker. Um, the cells in this layer are constantly undergoing division. They're constantly executing mitosis. The daughter cells are pushed upward to the more superficial layers, um, while one member of that cell division basically stays home and remains a stem cell, and that's so that the skin in that region can continuously regenerate. Above that layer is the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum is nicknamed the spiny layer because the cells in this layer are beginning to undergo a slow process of cell death. Their cytoplasm is beginning to shrink, and as a result, the cytoskeletal elements are beginning to become enhanced against the cell membrane. Hence, cells look like they have little spikes on them, and that's why we get the name spiny layer. The granulosum is above that, and in the granulosum, what's happening is that the cells are continuing to die. Their organelles are disappearing. Visible inclusions are starting to show up, and as a result, you get little dark spots in the cytoplasm. And above that, in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, is the stratum lucidium, which is made from dead cells of the deeper strata. Uh, they are devoid of organelles. They are devoid of metabolic activity for the most part, and they provide a protective layer uh, in the epidermis between the outside and the inside of the body. The stratum corneum is the outermost layer of epidermis. These are shingle-like dead cells filled with keratin. These are protective proteins that prevent water loss. So this is one of the most important roles of the skin to maintain fluid balance, and it does so both by waterproofing the body and also by controlling fluid levels through the process of sweating and controlling, of course, body temperature via the process of peripheral vasodilation, right, when the skin turns red when you're hot, and peripheral vasoconstriction when the skin turns white or pale in cooler temperatures and the hairs of the skin become erect. Melanin is a protective pigment made by melanocytes, which are mostly found in the stratum basale. The color of melanin is brown to black, and the amount of melanin produced depends on genetics and the amount of sunlight that the skin is exposed to. And the purpose of melanin is to protect against the UV rays of the sun, which can damage genetic material, causing mutations that can lead to skin cancer. The summary of the layers is actually shown in this diagram. This is the different layers of the epidermis. You can see here the stratum basale, the germinal layer of the skin containing the melanocytes, the Merkel cells, and constantly regenerating the layers of skin above it. The granulosum, which contain thick bundles of intermediate filaments made up of, the spinosum, which contain the thick bundles of intermediate filaments made up of pre-keratin, and the cells are beginning to take on that spiny appearance. And here you can see the granulosum. Okay, you can see the inclusions in the cell cytoplasm here as the cells are continuing to die. And then, of course, above it, the stratum lucidium in the palms of the hand, the soles of the feet, and above that, the corneum, shown here as layers of flat cells stacked one on top of the other. This entire region is made up of dead tissue. Okay. Note that the stratum lucidium is only hairless in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Everywhere else on the body, the skin contains hair follicles, which include the follicle, the bulb, the root, and the shaft of the hair, as well as, of course, the other organs that we associate with the dermis, the sweat glands, the oil glands, the nerve endings, and the erector pili muscle attached to every hair follicle, as well as the wealth of connective tissue, which is in the layer just below this germinal layer here, the dermis. So moving on to the dermis, we're getting deeper now inside the skin. There is a papillary layer, which is the upper dermal regions, which contain projections known as dermal papillae. Some of these contain capillary loops, and others house pain receptors and touch receptors. The papillary layer has ridges at its surface that protrude into the stratum basale, the germinal layer, and that's what gives us our fingerprints, palm prints, toe prints, and the prints on the soles of our feet. In other regions of the skin, these papillae don't produce as distinct a surface characteristic. The reticular layer is the deepest skin layer, and it contains blood vessels, sweat and oil glands, and pressure receptors, which are modified nerve endings that respond to pressure. Um, it also contains um, hair follicles and the associated hair bulb, root, and shaft, as well as the erector pili muscle, and of course, lots and lots of connective tissue, extracellular matrix that provides the ability to stretch and also resist mechanical force. The overall dermis structure is made up of collagen and elastic fibers located throughout the dermis. The collagen fibers give skin its toughness, and the elastic fibers give it its ability to stretch, while the blood vessels are important in the regulation of body temperature. And you're looking here at a cross-section of actual skin. I want you to take special note of this slide because it's very likely that you will see it on the lab practical, if not on the exam. And I want you to be able to tell the epidermal layer from the dermal layer from the hypodermal layer, which you can see a little bit of down here. Note the adipose tissue beginning to show up. Um, Notice that the papillary layer lies just below the germinative layer. That's the germinative layer I'm tracing right there. And the reticular layer lies just below the papillary layer. And both of these layers are, of course, dominated by connective tissue. Okay, you can see the arrangement of extracellular fibers, and if you look closely enough, you can pick up the the connective tissue cells, the fibroblasts that secrete this matrix. Notice that the stratum corneum, shown here, okay, the upper layer of dead cells, this is the granulosum, okay, the spinosal layer running through here, okay, and of course the germinative layer, which we already indicated. It's a little bit of a mystery why it is that stem cells are capable of dividing and having one member of the cell division grow up and become a differentiated tissue cell while the other cell remains home as a stem cell and continues to regenerate the adult tissue. We think part of the reason is due to the attachment of these stem cells to the underlying layers, and in that attachment are probably some cellular signals that tell those germ cells to stay home and remain as a mitotically active region of tissue that is constantly able to regenerate the layers of tissue above it. Now I want to talk a little bit about skin color. Melanin is a yellow, brown, or black pigment which has protective effects against the damaging UV rays of the sun. Carotene is an orange-yellow pigment that comes from some vegetables. It's a derivative of vitamin A, which actually is important in normal vision because it serves as the starting material for the production of a molecule called retinol, which is what responds to light in the retina of the eye. But it also can pigment the skin. Hemoglobin is a red-colored pigment that carries oxygen throughout the body. It's contained inside erythrocytes, red blood cells. Um, and we find this red coloring in the skin in the dermal capillaries, particularly when we're hot and the blood vessels vasodilate. Remember that the oxygen content determines how red the coloring is. The brighter the red color, more oxygen is being carried by the erythrocytes. The darker the red color, the less oxygen is being carried. This is why the blood in arteries appears red in the circulation that runs throughout most of the body, and why the blood in the veins, which is dark red, appears blue when we look at it through the tissue that makes up the venous system, the blood vessels that return blood back to the heart. Redness, which is clinically called erythema, can be due to embarrassment, inflammation, hypertension, fever, or allergy, while pallor is generally due to emotional stress such as fear, anemia, low blood pressure, or impaired blood flow to an area. Jaundice is caused by a buildup of bilirubin, which is a byproduct of the liver in the skin. It's generally an indication of some sort of liver failure. It generally causes not only a yellowing of the skin, but also a condition known as pruritus, which is intense itching because the compounds are extremely irritating. Bruises are basically bleeding underneath the epidermal layer, underneath the within the skin, so to speak. We call these hematomas. They will change color as the blood clots and is eventually reabsorbed. Okay, cutaneous glands are all exocrine in the skin. These include the sebaceous and sweat glands, each of which contain ducts and generate products which are secreted onto the surface of the skin. Other organs that are important include the hair follicles, and the nails. Again, the hair and the follicles that produce them have a thermoregulatory effect. They used to have a protective effect, although in humans there's relatively little hair compared to our other mammalian family members. And it also it used to have, well, it still has a sensory effect because the hair follicles are associated with nerve endings. We have the ability to sense fine touch when the hair follicles move as a result of the hairs being moved as something, say, crawls across our skin. The nails are primarily protective. They protect the tips of the fingers and the toes, but they used to be weapons. Of course, they used to be claws, but they've become modified in the human, and so they are simply a keratinized extracellular product that has primarily a protective function. And here you can see again a cross-section through the skin. We're looking here particularly at the sebaceous glands. You can see them here and here. You can also see them in the drawing here and here and here. And they produce oil or sebum, which is a skin lubricant and prevents the hair from becoming brittle and breaking off. It also has antibacterial properties. Most sebaceous glands have ducts that empty into hair follicles, while others go directly onto the skin surface. These glands become particularly activated at puberty when they can sometimes become infected by a bacteria known as acne vulgaris, causing the very common malady known as acne in the teenage years. Here you can see another exocrine gland of the skin. These are the sudiferous or sweat glands. You can see them here in cross section. This would be the lumen of the gland. This would be the epithelial tissue that surrounds it, and of course the connective tissue that is superficial to that. This is at 180x magnification, just so you know. You can see the connective tissue running between the sweat glands here. Their primary product is sweat, which is widely distributed in the skin as the glands are widely distributed. There's two types of sudiferous glands, eccrine and apocrine. The eccrine have ducts that open directly onto the skin surface from deep within the dermis, while the apocrine sweat glands have ducts that empty into hair follicles, particularly in the axillary and the inguinal region, and they begin to function primarily at puberty. They release a sweat that also contains fatty acids and proteins, and as a result contributes a lot to body odor as the bacteria break down those products in those secretions. Sweat is mostly water. It also contains salts and vitamin C and metabolic wastes such as urea and uric acid, as well as fatty acids and proteins, primarily in the apocrine secretions. It helps to dissipate excess heat. It also excretes waste products and also has an antimicrobial effect because the pH is rather low. So this inhibits bacterial growth. And again, the odor that is generated from sweat comes primarily from the bacterial breakdown of the fatty acids and the proteins and the other organic products that are in those secretions. Here you're looking at a cross section of a hair. You can see the hair follicle as well as the hair itself. Um, the hair is produced by the follicle, which consists of hard keratinized epithelial cells and melanocytes, which can provide pigment for the hair color. The hair grows in the matrix of the hair bulb in the stratum basale, the germinative layer. And so here you can see we're down here near where the hair is generated. You can pick up here the hair follicle. There is the dermal sheath and the epidermal sheath of the hair follicle. And then the hair itself is this part that I'm tracing through here. Of course, it leads on into a root and a shaft that protrudes through the epidermis. You can see here the growth zone of the hair in the hair bulb, okay, and the melanocytes, which provide the color for the hair, and these are the blood vessels that nourish the hair follicle, keep it alive, and of course, superficial to all that is adipose tissue primarily. If we were to dissect a hair, what we would see is a central cortex, or I'm sorry, central medulla and outer cortex, and then on the very outermost surface, you would see a cuticle, a waxy coating that protects the rest of the structure of the hair. And here you can see a cross section through an actual hair with the medulla, the cortex surrounding it, the cuticle on the outside of the cortex, which is heavily keratinized. Remember, the keratin is an extremely mechanically tough protein. It resists stretching and pulling. And it's the protein that becomes altered when people have, for instance, a permanent, when they go into the hairstylist and they want to either change their straight hair to curly or their curly hair to straight. The treatments that are employed are designed to change the three-dimensional structure of the hair keratin so that it either produces a wavy or a straight or a curly appearance after the treatment. And this is primarily due to the rearrangement of very strong covalent bonds in the keratin protein called disulfide bonds, which only occur between cysteine residues in the hair keratin. Other associated structures include the hair follicle, which has a dermal and epidermal sheath around the hair root, the erector pili muscle, which is made up of smooth muscle, which pulls the hair upright when we're cold or when we're frightened, as well as sebaceous and sudiferous glands, which we've already addressed. And you can see here a cross-section through a hair. You can see the hair shaft protruding through the epidermal and dermal layers, the erector pili muscle, the associated sebaceous gland, the root, and of course the hair bulb that is down here at the very base of the follicle. Okay, so it's the follicle that's responsible for this essentially dead hair appendage, or dead cellular appendage. And here you can look at a micrograph of a hair follicle. Notice how the scale-like cells of the cuticle overlap each other in this hair shaft image. This is 660x, so this is highly magnified, but you can see the cuticle here. Of course, under it would be the cortex, and then under that would be the medulla. Okay, nails are scale-like modifications of the epidermis. They are heavily keratinized. The stratum basale extends beneath the nail bed and is responsible for the growth of the nail. This is where the new nail is made. Lack of pigment makes them relatively colorless, and you can see here a view of the nail both in sagittal section and from a superior aspect. This is the free edge of the nail and the body, and the lunula, this little crescent-shaped, lightly pigmented area just beneath the actual nail, and then the lateral nail folds. And then, of course, if we take a look at the sagittal section, You can see the proximal nail fold here and also here, okay, and the root of the nail, which is where the nail is growing, and the nail matrix here. It has, of course, again, a free edge, the body, which is the visible attached portion, and the root, which is embedded in the skin. We can't see this unless we were to take a sagittal section through your finger or through your toe. The cuticle is the proximal nail fold that projects onto the nail body. You probably heard that you should always push your cuticles back in order to keep your nails relatively healthy. For those of you that are familiar with the condition known as nail fungus, the this pathogen likes to live in the under the nail root, and what he'll do is he will grow in this area where there's a relatively little blood supply but a lot of skin to feed off of. It's also relatively moist and warm, and that's perfect for fungal growth. And what he'll do is he'll cause the nail to thicken and rise up, and this can become irritating when you're wearing footwear, especially snugly fitting footwear. The treatments for this include oral and topical medications, but they tend to be relatively ineffective, primarily due to the fact that it's very difficult to get a medication down into the nail root in order to kill the fungus. There is a cure, of course, which is to remove the nail and to, as a result, deprive the fungus of its hiding place. But of course, when you do that, the likelihood that the nail will grow back is relatively limited. Okay, one of the things we want to talk about before we're done today is conditions of the skin that disturb homeostasis. We're here talking particularly about burns. This is tissue damage and cell death which is caused by heat, electricity, UV radiation, or chemicals. Associated dangers with the destruction of skin, including the germinative layer, include dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, as well as circulatory shock, all again the product of fluid loss, massive fluid loss from the body. When this happens, of course, when you have these burns that go below the stratum basale of the skin, it's very difficult for the skin to regrow. If we destroy that germinative layer, best case scenario is that we leave the dermis intact and we're able to produce scar tissue in order to patch the injury. If the burn or the chemical insult goes deeper than that, then the ability to regrow the integument is completely obliterated, and what we have to do at that point is attempt to graft the skin, generally from some other region in that person's body, in order to cover the open wound and let it regrow. Or sometimes we can actually grow skin using culture systems and reseed the injured area and hope that the stem cells will generate enough tissue in order to restore function. The rule of nines is a way to determine the extent of a burn. The body is basically divided into 11 areas for a quick estimation of the percent of body burned. Each area represents about 9% of the total body surface area. And so you can see here that the front of both arms is 9%, the trunk 18%, the head, front of the head 4.5%, the whole head would be 9%, the perineum 1%, and the anterior lower limbs 9%. So if we burn the back and the front of the legs, that would be 18% per leg. And what we're looking at here are just some different types of burns. In a first-degree burn, only the epidermis is damaged. The skin will become red and swollen, but eventually what will happen is that epidermal layer will peel off and be regenerated. In a second-degree burn, the epidermis and the upper dermis are damaged. The skin can become red with blisters. It will generally regenerate, although there may be some scarring, while third-degree burns destroy the entire skin layer and oddly enough, these burns are painless because the nerve endings have been destroyed. The burn will appear either gray, white, or black, and we have to resort to grafting in order to repair this type of extensive damage. Burns are considered critical if over a quarter of the body has second-degree burns or over 10% of the body has third-degree burns. There are also third-degree burns that can occur on the face, the hands, or the feet. Other conditions that affect the skin include infections, which can be bacterial, fungal, or viral, or the result of immune responses to skin irritation, such as dermatitis. Examples include athlete's foot, known as tinea pedis, which is caused by a fungal infection. Remember that when we're talking about fungal infections, the places that fungus likes to grow include places that are dark, moist, and relatively warm. So one of the ways to avoid athlete's foot is not only to clean between the toes, but also to keep the toes out in the open, even in the wintertime, so that you can get air between them and reduce the ability of the fungus to try and grow and irritate the skin, cause it to peel and itch. Boils and carbuncles can be caused by bacterial infection, and essentially they produce a bulging area under the skin that's usually filled with a purulent discharge, which is the result, again, of the immune system attempting to fight the bacterial infection. Cold sores are caused by a viral infection. Generally, what happens with a viral infection is that the virus will invade the nervous system and can remain dormant in nerves that supply the integument for years, and then, given the proper conditions, the virus can emerge from those nerve endings, and when they do, when they erupt from the distal ends of the peripheral nerves, they can cause the skin to open up and blister and inflame, and it's an extremely painful condition that can result in secondary bacterial infection if we're not careful. So examples of this include cold sores and the skin sores associated with chickenpox, which is caused by a virus known as herpes zoster, which can in older adults produce the condition known as shingles. And what you're looking at here are just some examples of different skin irritations. Infections and allergies, of course, can cause the skin to inflame. Those are basically immune responses to irritants or to pathogens, and this can cause contact dermatitis. Examples of this are shown here, for instance, with psoriasis, an extreme example of this particular condition. Impetigo is caused by bacterial infection of the skin. You can see that here. And then psoriasis, which we believe is essentially an immune response of the skin to some sort of trigger. Can be an environmental trigger, could be something within the immune system itself. And examples of some of these triggers, other examples include trauma, infection, and stress. The skin becomes reddened and cracked, and it can peel, and the cracks can go deep down into the integument, and the potential for infection then becomes obvious. Skin cancer is caused by a mutation in the genetic material that affects genes that control the rate of cell division. It's an abnormal mass that can be classified either as benign or malignant. A benign mass does not have the ability to spread from its initial point of origin, so it's said to be what's called encapsulated, while a malignant cancer has the ability to move to other parts of the body, usually via the lymphatic or the circulatory system. It's a much more serious condition because those cells that spread via these roots can set up new centers of cancerous growth in the lymph nodes or in any region of the body that the metastatic cells end up landing. And the way that cancer eventually kills you is that it essentially hijacks your body's oxygen and nutrients to the point where your organs, your tissues are starved for those critical components, and they essentially shut down. So in a way, it almost sucks the life out of you, just as if a vampire would. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer. Here is an example of a basal cell carcinoma. This is the least malignant form of skin cancer and the most common type. It arises generally from mutations in the stratum basale. Remember that that is the germinative layer of the epidermis. Generally, when you see any kind of cancer occur, it is usually in mitotically active cells due to the fact that every time a cell divides, there's the potential for a mistake in the genetic material to be made. And so the more often a cell divides, the more often those mistakes can happen. This is why it's relatively rare to see cancers, for instance, in neurons, because they hardly ever divide. Whereas if you look at things like the epidermis or the connective tissue, you can see cancers occurring there due to their high mitotic index. Squamous cell carcinoma is another type of cancer. It metastasizes to lymph nodes if it is not removed. Early removal allows a good chance for a cure. It's believed to be sun-induced and arises from the stratum spinosum. Remember, those are the cells that are in the process of dying. They are superficial to the basale and deep to the granulosum and the corneum. Malignant melanoma is the most deadly type of skin cancer, and it metastasizes rapidly to the lymph and to the blood vessels. We try and detect these types of cancers using a rule known as the ABCD rule, which states that if you have a discolored area on the skin that shows asymmetry, where the two sides of the pigmented area do not match, or have an irregular border where the borders of the pigmented area are not smooth, or we see different colors in the pigmented area, or a change in the diameter where the spot perhaps is larger than 6 millimeters. This can be an indication of a melanoma, and what we would have to do is surgically remove it, and then in the event that we suspect that it is metastasized, more serious interventions would have to be employed, such as radiation therapy and chemotherapy. And you've probably heard of those types of treatments before, and wondered how it is that they work. So essentially, if we go back to this idea of where does cancer come from, and it comes from errors in the genetic material, which can be the result of exposure to environmental mutagens, exposure to radiation, even viruses have been associated with the spread of cancer because they rearrange the genetic material of healthy tissue when they infect it. Essentially, what happens is then the cell begins to grow in an out-of-control fashion. The idea behind radiation and chemotherapy is that in both approaches, we attempt to introduce massive amounts of mistakes into the genetic material of the metastatic tissue and as a result kill it. The unfortunate side effect, of course, is that we will also kill other healthy, rapidly dividing tissue, and as a result, individuals who are on radiation and chemotherapy often become quite ill before they actually recover from the disease. They'll lose their hair, their hematocrit will drop, they'll lose the lining of their gut, their skin will thin, and they'll be quite miserable until the malignancy has been dealt with, and at which point we can stop the chemotherapy and hopefully the cancer will be ablated. Other places that cancer can come from, believe it or not, are a result of a suppressed immune system. Every time a cell divides, even though theoretically in mitosis the copying of genetic material is supposed to be perfect, what can sometimes happen in that process is that we can make a mistake in the generation of a new DNA molecule. And if that mistake occurs on or near a gene that controls cell division, the result could be a cancerous cell. when this happens in the body, and it happens on a daily basis, the immune system is generally able to detect those cells because they display unusual antigens on their surfaces, and as a result are earmarked for destruction by the immune system. But if the immune system is compromised due to, say, um, an immunodeficiency disorder or perhaps a form of leukemia, the result can be metastatic cancer due to the fact that the immune system wasn't able to catch it in time using its function as immune surveillance, which is essentially the immune system patrolling the body, and every time it sees either an infected cell or a cancer cell, um, it kills it either by punching holes in the cell membrane and causing the cytoplasm to leak out, or by um, producing toxins in the area of the infected or cancer cell, and it causes the cell to kill itself. And again, when the immune system is compromised, those processes don't happen the way that they're supposed to. Okay, this brings us to the end of Chapter 4. Please let me know if you have any questions. Contact me by phone or by email. Good time to get me, of course, is when I'm tutoring on Monday from 9 to 11 or Friday from 5 to 7. You can call me on my cell phone or email me or Skype me, whichever works best. I prefer not text messaging because I don't have one of those smartphones. I work better with email, so please let me know if you have any questions. Please review this material in your textbook, as well as watch the appropriate videos on the website in order to reinforce what we've talked about here today. And this should prepare you adequately to do well on the exam. So I will see everybody in class. Thanks.